going on, everybody? You're listening to the second episode of the Combat Chronicles, where we talk everything going on in the world of combat sports today. I'm your host, Jordon Martell. Thank y'all so much for tuning in. If y'all checked out my first episode, much love to all y'all. Appreciate the support. And for those that have not watched my first episode and plan on going back to it, just a quick disclaimer. In the first minute or so, there's a couple little glitchy, distorted spots. Almost sounds like somebody's fast forwarding. When I initially had done all my editing and revising, that had not been there before. So I'm a little bit scratching my head on that one. Not to worry though, when I get time, I will go back and fix it. As far as I heard, it's only those two spots in the very beginning. Other than that, the rest of the episode's pretty much clean. So again, I will touch those up when I get time. It's just that this International Fight Week is kicking my ass. 3 cards in 1 week is a lot to push out. Not to mention I'm a dumbass and the editing takes a while. So more than likely your boy's doing a couple all-nighters. Of course, it would help if this card wasn't at 9 a.m. on a Wednesday morning. Be a little bit less of a time crunch, but not to worry, we're going to make it happen. And with that, let's get right on into it. As of right now, no changes to any upcoming bouts. Nobody COVID positive. Good news there. Still 14 fights on the Wednesday card. The main event, of course, to that is Michael Chiesa versus Magny. The bout that was initially supposed to main event for this card. Khamzat Chimaev versus Leon Edwards. That, of course, rebooked all the way out to March 13th. Due to Khamzat testing positive for COVID-19. March 13th shaping up to have a pretty nice card, though. This put Dan Ige versus Ryan Hall on that card. You got Darren Stewart versus Eric, your boy Anders. Both guys that like to throw down and bang. That's one I don't see going a distance. We got Cyril Gane versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik for the co-main. That's a fun one that somebody's more than likely going to get floored in. Overall, I'm loving a lot of these fight night cards, man. A lot of the times I found that the ones that were actually free were the ones that I was actually more willing to pay for. I mean, either which way I'm buying it regardless. But push come to shove and I could only afford to do one per month. A lot of the times I would have opted to pick one of those fight nights to pay for rather than those pay-per-views, but you never really can know for sure until they play out. So with that, let's get into the fights this past weekend. The first were a triple header. You had Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar. Absolutely exceptional performance on Max's end. He's just so fucking good, man. And Dana tried to say that wasn't the best performance of his career. And that does go with saying it is very hard to pick from because he has been around for 9 years and has delivered some serious ass whoopings. But I can't recall a time when anybody has ever gotten 3 10-8 rounds in a fight before. That was an absolutely exceptional performance on Max's end. One side the entire way through. And all the credit to Calvin Kattar, man, because that man took it. I definitely feel that fight should have been stopped in the 4th round, but we'll talk a little bit more on it later. First, let's touch on the prelims real quick. First up, you had Jacob Kilburn versus Austin Lingo. Austin Lingo taking it by unanimous decision. I'm pretty sure I had Austin Lingo winning it. I think by 2nd round knockout, though. With Jacob Kilburn never being knocked out before, I figured he wasn't going to be one of those guys that Austin Lingo victimized in the 1st round. Although he did come fairly close early on. Caught Kilburn by surprise with a counter left and sat him down. Kilburn did an excellent job at recovering, though. I definitely feel like Austin Lingo trying to finish Kilburn early on in that fight definitely worked against his favor because he had him hurt in the opening 2 minutes of the fight. And Austin Lingo being a dude that's accustomed to finishing his guys in the first minute 30 of the fight, felt that with Kilburn hurt that it was safe to pour it on him. And unfortunately for him, with Jacob Kilburn being the tough SOB that he is, managed to outlast Lingo's onslaught early. And despite being knocked down in the 1st, I think he came into that 2nd round a lot more fresher. Austin Lingo seemed a lot more labored. For a vast majority of the round, he was very stationary and very flat-footed. For all I know, maybe he took that 2nd round off because he took into account that he gassed himself out in the 1st round. So maybe he wanted to make sure he had that 3rd round left. Because although he is one of those guys that finishes his fights really quickly, and typically a pattern with those guys that we see is they tend to not have a gas tank because they figure they got the touch of God. So therefore, they never have to run a mile in their life. They never have to jump rope. They never have to do sprints or hills because they figure in their eyes, as long as they got 5 good minutes in them, that they're almost a cinch to pull out the win. Not exactly the case when they finally make it to the big leagues, because usually within the first fight or two, they encounter that opponent that's able to take them into deep waters and into those second and third rounds. And after that 5 minutes is over, you see the guy huff and win. He already perspirating while the other guy dry as a bone. And then in those second and third rounds, they tend to get picked apart and then wind up losing the unanimous decision. If not the combination of exhaustion and his opponent punching him in the face constantly, they potentially might end up getting finished in the third. But one trait Austin Lingo seems to have that a lot of those power hitters typically don't is that he has this third win, backup reserve tank heading into the third round. That's why he still remains to be successful in all but one of his decisions. So he definitely has a good established sense of pace that he does well with. Not a guy I would see doing a 5-round fight anytime soon. But this puts him at 1-1 in the UFC. I think a fun matchup for Austin Lingo at 45 would maybe be Jonathan Pearce, maybe Spike Carlisle, a similar style of fighter. Both guys swing for the fences. Both guys very twitchy, very explosive, which tends to result in both guys gassing fairly quickly, which is going to result in one of two things. It's either going to be the most boring decision on the planet, or it's going to be a slugfest until one of them drops. Both of which I'm willing to take a spin on. As for Jacob Kilburn, this now puts him at 0-2 in the UFC. And not to keep pushing the alpha ginger, but Spike Carlisle again, with both guys losing the last 2 fights. And the UFC looking to lay a bunch of fighters off. This could make for a good potential pink slip match. Shane Woodson, a guy that's coming off of his first loss, that has the makings to be a fun one. Shane Woodson very long, very lanky, has a high strike output. Jacob Kilburn, a very no fucks given type of fighter. Definitely somebody that's willing to exchange with him. Also well polished in pretty much every area of MMA. So he can vote to be very tricky for Shane Woodson. If the UFC is looking to have Jacob Kilburn rebound, maybe gain some traction, come back with a win. Because although he did lose both, he did have a pretty good showing in both outings. So he might be one the UFC is looking to keep around for a little bit. I'm not quite sure on what Daniel Tamer's contract's looking like with the UFC, but he's a guy that's had a pretty long layoff, hasn't fought since 2019. He's a guy that lost 4 out of 5 in the UFC. So maybe the UFC can look to play out the rest of his contract. Jacob Kilburn matches up pretty well with him. So if he loses, that's one less roster spot Dana has to worry about. If he wins by impressive fashion, they might earn himself another contract. But second on the night, you had Vanessa Mello taking on Sarah Morse. Vanessa picking up her first win in the UFC by unanimous decision. I said in the first episode, if Vanessa could take her all the way to distance, then she'd have a pretty good chance of winning it. Turns out that was indeed the case. Historically, Sarah Morse has not done well on the scorecards. This now marks 6 out of her 7 losses by decision. In of her 7 fights that have gone the full, she has only won 1 of them. The rest of Sarah Morse's wins are all by finish. But no question, I have Vanessa winning the vast majority of that entire 15. Vanessa was the one pressing the action the entire time. Definitely landed the more impactful, meaningful shots. Sarah was almost timid and gun shy. Wasn't even really looking to exchange with her too much. I think Vanessa hit her with a shot early on that caught her attention. And from that point on, Sarah wanted no part of it. Vanessa did struggle to cut off the octagon some. So maybe have cage and octagon control be the main focal point of your next camp. Otherwise, her best performance yet. And to be fair, although she was 0-3 up until this point in the UFC, she's fought some damn tough females, man. In her debut, she freaking drew Irene Aldana, who is currently ranked number 5 in the female bantamweight division, so no favors in that one. Second, she drew Tracy Cortez, again no favors there. And Tracy very well could be one of the best, if not the best, grapplers in that division. Very strong wrestling foundation. Actually, if I'm not mistaken, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe her brother, may he rest in paradise, was on the same high school wrestling team as Henry Cejudo, who, although I'm not a fan of his corny theatrics, the motherfucker is still nice. And if there's one thing he's exceptional at, if nothing else, is how to control and take down bigger opponents. And with her being a very tiny 135er, she couldn't have a better teacher in that department. which is honestly probably the reason that she only has 2 finishes out of her 8 wins. Something tells me if she dropped down to 205, 125, my apologies, I definitely think you would start to see her put a lot more girls away. But don't fix what's not broke already. She's already 8-1. Actually, kind of surprised she's not ranked. I think she's performed a lot better than Sijara Eubanks. Sijara a lot more active, but overall, I think Tracy's the better talent. But all that beside the point. And thirdly, Vanessa Drew Carol Rosas, who's another solid 135er. 13-3, only been finished twice by submission, has finished over half her fights. Vanessa brought it all the way to a decision, despite ultimately taking the loss. Now with this win, she can finally start to build some momentum. Later in the night, you had Jocelyn Edwards making her debut. She looked pretty damn good. I believe they're in the same weight class. I personally wouldn't be mad at that matchup. Makes a lot of sense. Both girls are pretty much at the same point in their career. As for Sarah Morris, and I was going to maybe say do this one for Vanessa Mello because I believe this was initially what was booked. But I believe Sarah Morris' probably best bet would be Betch Kohea. This up until an injury forced her out was supposed to be Betch Kohea's retirement fight. With Sarah only winning 1 out of her last 6. That'd be a good opportunity to maybe prove herself one more time because the female bantamweight division doesn't have a whole lot of depth to it right now. So I don't think she'll be a part of the cuts. I could be wrong though. I oftentimes am. But if they do keep her, that'd be one good last opportunity to maybe save her job. And if she manages to take out on that one, because as we already talked about, Sarah's Achilles heel, the judges' scorecards, and I believe most of Betch's wins are by decision. So that would vote to be a very good match for Betch Kohea to go out on. Potentially close her career out on a win, which very few do. Regardless of if Sarah Morris gets cut though, I still think she'll find a job somewhere, either ONE FC or Bellator, because she still does have some name value being one of the pioneers of female fighting. But if not, and she opts to retire, which I think isn't a bad move at this point, there's a lot of things she can do. She can coach, she can do seminars, many different things she can do to keep close to the sport. If that is what she opts to do, of course. Third up, you had Ramazan Emeev versus David Zawada. Ramazan taking this one by split decision, which I was a little perplexed by. I thought he handily won the first and second round. The third round, if I'm not mistaken, was the one where Zawada managed to counter Ramazan and wound up in a dominant position for a vast majority of that round. All in all, not the most exciting matchup. Not exactly a fight that's going to make Dana White want to give you a push. Exciting or not, Ramazan makes a very hard case not to. He's currently 9-1 in his last 10 outings, falling to Anthony Rocco Martin due to a decision in 2019. Aside from that, essentially been flawless. But because it wasn't a matchup that got the fans jumping out of their seats, which, by the way, couldn't be happier to see the fans back in the stands. I know a lot of people were big on the empty Apex, which was nice for a while. I do think it thinned out the herd as far as ignorant MMA fans go. You get a lot less of those guys that say leg kicks ain't shit. Those punches don't hurt. This shit's nothing. I can do this shit for a living, no problem. Now all of a sudden mute out the crowd. Now all of a sudden you can hear them leg kicks. Now you get a lot less of them motherfuckers chirping, acting like they want the smoke. So I thought it was very important as far as getting the fans to appreciate what the fighters put into it, what kind of damage the fighters endure day in and day out. But there's nothing I love more than the energy of an emphatic crowd after somebody scores a knockout. But anyway, again, with Ramazan not exactly having the most impressive victory, I think Dana's still going to opt to put him through the ringer. At this point in time, with Santiago Ponzinibbio struggling to find a foothold back in the UFC after a long, lengthy layoff. This, of course, due to health reasons. As we'll get to later, Santiago, of course, lost his matchup in the first round via knockout to Li Zhangliang, who's probably the most underrated killer in the welterweight division. With Ramazan not being somebody that's going to beat him on the feet, the risk of Santiago getting starched this time around would be a lot less likely. Maybe a matchup odds are that goes the full 13, which is something I think Santiago needs at this moment in time. I hate to use the word tuna fight, but for lack of a better term, Santiago being a guy that would benefit from having as many rounds as possible. Ramazan a guy that's more than likely going to take him into those deep waters and give him those rounds. And you got to remember, Santiago isn't that far removed from being on the welterweight rankings. The only reason he isn't is because of his inactivity. So if Ramazan can pull out a victory over Santiago Ponzinibbio, entertaining style or not, That's definitely the kind of opponent that's going to earn him a top 15. You got Dirty Bird Tim Means, another guy that's looking to crack the top 15. Nicholas Dalby looked good in his last performance. As for Zawada, I believe this marks him losing 3 out of his last 4, if I'm not mistaken. So, depends what the UFC wants to do with him. If they want to keep him around, potential options, you got Mickey Gall, who's coming off of a loss, who in my eyes still hasn't earned his stripes in the UFC yet. And it's no disrespect intended when I say it, but when 2 of your wins in the UFC are over guys that are not only making their UFC debut, but their MMA debut, and one of those guys is a former WWE superstar who just picked up MMA in his 30s, and no disrespect to CM Punk, it is not a young mid-30s. But that's what happens when you fall victim to a brutal WWE schedule that you only get 2 weeks out of the year as far as a day off or a vacation. So, of course, you're going to be weathered and beat down. But take those 2 victories away. You got him picking up a rear naked choke over Sage Northcutt. Young guy, very talented. Still very underdeveloped as a martial artist, though, especially on the ground. If I have to tip my hat to Mickey Gall in any area, it's absolutely his jiu-jitsu. I believe he's still a brown belt under Henzo, if I'm not mistaken. I could have the lineage wrong. He is from Jersey, so probably. But after that, they gave him Randy Brown. Pretty solid matchup. Randy Brown, a very good all-around martial artist. Mickey Gall lost to him via unanimous decision. Following that, got a win over George Sullivan, who's had a bit of a journeyman's career. He's 18-8, and of those 8 losses, 5 of them have been by submission. Mickey Gall, of course, with very strong grappling credentials, so one would expect that to be the outcome. After that, you had him taking an L to Diego Sanchez by TKO. Similar narrative, picked up another win after that. Picked up that one by unanimous decision. That was over Salam Tahori. Salam in his UFC run was 0-3, so not a very successful run on his end. And most recently just took the L to Mike Perry, which he didn't look horrible in. So by giving Mickey Gall a guy like David Zawada, who has a lot of experience, very dangerous, a lot of finishing capability. Zawada, a very tough guy to finish on the ground. Only one of his losses have been by submission, and that is at a 23 contest. So if Mickey Gall can pull out a submission finish over him, definitely one he'll earn his stripes on. Fourth up, you had the power hitters, Carlos Felipe versus Justin Tafa. And let me tell you, for a decision between 2 heavyweights, this was a fun one to watch. And I can't recount a time I did say that about a heavyweight fight that ended in a decision. Both big boys brought it that night. Justin Tafa picked apart Carlos for much of the first round. Once Justin started to ease into his groove and find his flow in the second, Carlos clipped him heavy and threw off his equilibrium, which essentially had him jacked up the rest of the fight. Wound up handily taking the second. And then in all honesty, the third one you could probably give either way. But with Carlos building momentum as the fight progressed, and as we know, the part of the fight that the judges remember the most is, of course, the end. So all in all, that's probably why they graded it in way of Felipe. That now puts him at 2-1 in the UFC. Still looking to pick up his first finish, but was a very game opponent both times. His debut, which he lost to Sergey Spavak, which I also think was a short notice fight. This, of course, at the peak of COVID, too, where all the gyms were closed. So you got to figure at this point, Carlos Felipe was probably very out of shape. But when you're a fighter, the UFC contract's what you do it for. So when guys finally get that call, odds are they're not going to turn it down. Ever since then, he's looked solid. But because he has yet to get that emphatic finish to separate him from the other heavyweights, I think the UFC is going to continue giving him unproven guys. Guys like Parker Porter, who's just coming off a nice win over Josh Parisian. You got Contender Series alum Dontel Mays. He's a fun one to watch, always looking to trade. Now in the case of Justin Tafa, on the flip side, you can give him Josh Parisian, who just took the L to Parker Porter. Gian Vellante is a guy that's been on quite a bit of a skid, both of which are kickboxers. Gian, of course, been in the UFC for quite a while now. I think he's got something like 16 bouts in the UFC. That puts him at the top end of the UFC's pay scale. I think he made something close to $78,000. That was with a loss. So close to $150,000 if he were to win. With him losing 6 out of his last 8, and both of those wins come by split decision, you would figure in order to make cap space, the UFC would be looking to part ways with Gian. So maybe look to run out the rest of his contract. Meanwhile, being able to build one of your younger prospects. Tafa's still very green in his MMA career, only 4-2. And with Gian being a 30-fight vet and experiencing as much as he has over the years, I think it'd be a very valuable thing for Justin Tafa to face him. And if not him, you do have Greg Hardy coming off a loss over Marcin Tybura. Both guys fresh in their careers. Both guys are looking to improve and expand their skill set. And for the most part, they face the same company. Both Tafa and Hardy have mutual opponents in Juan Adams and Jorgen De Castro. So if I were to make a guess on which one the UFC is going to book next, it'd probably be this one. But still a fun one. I have no complaints. I know everybody feels about Greg Hardy, but he still delivers what people want, and that are knockouts. And Justin Tafa being a protege of Mark Hunt, I'm willing to bet Tafa's not going to grapple Greg Hardy if they do face off. So despite how everybody feels on Greg Hardy, this is indeed a matchup I would love to see. Hopefully it delivers as advertised if they do face off. But for the prelim main event, you had debuting Jocelyn Edwards taking on Mulan Wu Yan. And for a fighter making her debut in the octagon, didn't seem to let the moment get to her. Showed excellent poise, an excellent all-around game. She does train at a King's MMA, who, if you don't know, has produced talents such as Kelvin Gastelum, Marvin Vettori. Both guys at the top of the middleweight division. Both guys very well-rounded. Marvin a potential title contender his next time around. So she surrounds herself with good company. As for potential matchups, we already talked a little bit about her fighting Vanessa Mello. Both relatively at the same point in their career. Both trying to establish a name for themselves. Other than that, you really don't have a whole lot of options. Everyone either booked up or on medical suspension. The best potential matchup you can give her is maybe Jessica Rose Clark. But other than that, you're looking at a very shallow pool from her to pick from. As for Wu Yan, still a very young developing martial artist, only age 24. So for her, really just look to fine-tune everything, absorb as much as you can, be a sponge, maybe take a little time off, assess her options. Like I said, not a whole lot of fighters freed up in the women's 135, so I think she's going to have quite a bit to wait anyway. In the meantime, just keep working, learning, retain as much as you can in the meantime. That way when another fight does roll around, you'll essentially be a reinvented fighter with a brand new skill set. That way your next time around when you get that call, you'll be ready to show out. But with that, we bring our prelims to a close. Kicking off our prelim was Punahele Soriano versus Dusko Todorovic. Nice little matchup between two murderers that are coming up in the middleweight division. Both guys undefeated, at least up until Saturday. Punahele coming away with a first round knockout with 12 seconds to go. But I found it to be very one-sided. I felt like Soriano dominated him the entire time. I sure as hell hope this boy got some kind of backroom deal or something, because I think he got robbed out of that $50K. The Li Zhangliang knockout was nice and all, and understandably so, it was on Santiago Ponzinibbio. But I found Soriano's win to be a lot more dominant, a lot more impressive. Dropped Dusko a couple times throughout that first round. Had him hurt 3 times at minimum. But I don't know what it is. This dude, Dusko Todorovic, loses his mouth guard every single fight. Not only that, he's had a similar incidents like this where his mouth guard falls in between the cage and the mat. They have to do a pause in the action. And conveniently enough, it's only at times when he's either really hurt or at danger of getting knocked out. Now, I don't know if he's doing it on purpose. This is merely me just noticing a pattern. For all I know is maybe he chooses not to mold his mouthpiece, but that may have to be something the refs look at a little more closely if he continues on doing it. Because it happened not 2 fights ago in this Contender Series matchup. Similar narrative where he was hurt up against the cage, and conveniently enough, his mouthpiece falls in between the cracks. So, very well could be a coincidence, or is a sneaky little trick Dusko got in his arsenal. Either which way, it did not help him in this one. But all in all, I'd like to see Punahele maybe take on the winner of Mahmoud Madurov versus Andrew Sanchez. That matchup, I believe, is this Saturday. Both guys loads of experience. Madurov a vet of around 30 fights. Andrew Sanchez, of course, an Ultimate Fighter winner. Sanchez is a very talented fighter, if that wasn't obvious. But a lot of guys tend to brush him under the rug because he's doofy looking and doesn't look like much. But he's indeed a boy that will put your lights out. Either which way, if Punahele can pull out an impressive victory this next time out, then he very well could be looking at the top 15. Punahele is a super talented kid. I wouldn't be surprised if by the start of next year that you see him in the top 10. That, of course, in the middleweight division. If not him, maybe the winner of Brad Tavares versus Antonio Carlos Jr. Both guys formerly in the top 15. So if Punelli can pick up a win over either one of them, that puts him in a good position. And thirdly, you can maybe look at Edmund Shabazian, who's recently coming off a loss over Derek Brunson. Another young, talented middleweight. I believe he actually might be ranked still. For Dusko, I like the idea of him maybe fighting Joaquin Buckley, who also lost in similar fashion later on that night. Chalking up at Elta Alessio to Cherico. That came in the first round via head kick. But both guys very exciting middleweights to watch. Joaquin, a similar style and fighter as Punelli. The guy's predominantly a striker, doesn't really go on the ground too much. More or less a calculated brawler if I had to put a tag on it. And if Dusko can pick up a win over Buckley, that makes for a pretty good redemption as far as his first loss goes. You also got Teflon and Chokwe, who, although he just won his recent match against Jamie Pickett, he's still only 4-0, 5-0, one of those. So no, Chokwe is still in the greener stage of his career. Still got a lot of work on, a lot to develop. At least by matching up with Dusko Todorovic. Or matching him up with a guy that's going to put him through the ringer. A guy that could potentially be in the world title picture. A guy that can hurt him in a lot of different ways. Todorovic, very underrated on the ground. Has a very good top game, so he could potentially get in a chokeway in a lot of situations where he's not familiar or comfortable. And if Dusko wins, he picks up an impressive win over a guy that's been flatlining everybody. He's literally a more condensed version of Francis Ngannou. And if Todorovic can chalk this one up as a win in the early stage of an Chokwe's career, he may not have to worry about him down the line, where he's going to be a lot more dangerous and a lot more equipped with tools, all which gear to hurt you in a violent manner. If not him, I like the idea of him maybe fighting Jordan Williams, Jordan Wright. Two guys also coming off a loss. Jordan Wright coming off a loss to Joaquin Buckley. Jordan Williams losing to Nordine Imavov. Imavov got the nod via unanimous decision. All hard on Jordan Williams' end, man. When guys say that they're willing to die in that octagon, there's guys that are frauds and guys that mean it. Jordan Williams is 100% one of those guys that mean it. He did not back down from Imavov one bit. And Imavov a much bigger opposition. The combination that Imavov fights at 185 and the fact that Jordan Williams can't cut weight because he's diabetic, so he comes in around 180, 178 maybe, which tends to work against him. But size differential or not, Jordan Williams matches up really well with Dusko Todorovic. Surprisingly more so in the favor of Jordan Williams. Jordan, the much more durable fighter. He almost welcomes the contact, whereas Dusko Todorovic doesn't seem to really want any part of it. So if Jordan can make that a dogfight, he has a very good chance in taking that one. Then in the case of Dusko, after coming off a vicious knockout loss, this is kind of a nice way to ease back into it. Really no such thing when you're fighting in the UFC. But if you're going to take a step back, you might as well do it against somebody that's going to come in at 170 or 180. Somebody you know you're going to have a serious size differential over because you're going to balloon up back to maybe 200 pounds by then. If you can stop a guy as tough as Jordan Williams, then he'll be right back in the picture, no problem. And we might as well just go right into the Joaquin Buckley matchup because that one was directly after this anyway. So Joaquin Buckley took the L to Alessio Cherico via head kick in the first round, as we talked about earlier. Why I like the Dusko matchup for Joaquin is because similar narrative with Jordan Williams. He's a guy that very much welcomes the contact. He's a guy that's willing to take 3 to give 1. Dusko, a much more rangy sniper-esque type. Likes to pick you apart from the distance. Not really a fan of contact. This honestly probably a matchup that favors Joaquin a lot more than Dusko. But with Joaquin being this mainstream highlight reel that's been moving the needle the past couple months. So a nice win over Todorovic could put him right back in the mainstream. If not him, I like the idea of him fighting that James Krause matchup, because I do like the hostility that comes with that one. Krause primarily a welterweight, but is a tweener, has gone up to 185. Actually on a day's notice to fight Trevin Giles, which I think he won. There's a whole conspiracy on that I'm not going to get into. We'll talk about that at a later date to prevent me ranting for about another half hour. But I'm starting to look at James Krause in a little more skeptical manner, because with as many people that are calling him out, because now you got Diego Sanchez calling him out. You have Joaquin that's willing to oblige. With as many people that are calling out James Krause, I'm starting to wonder if he's the asshole. As that old saying go, if you think one thing and everyone around you thinks the other, then maybe it's you. A little something to think about. As for the winner, Alessio Cherico, I cannot emphasize enough how crucial this win was for his career. Alessio at the wrong end of 3 straight, losing back-to-back against Kevin Holland, then Mahmoud Madurov, then Zach Cummings, none of which are oppositions to hang their head on. Kevin Holland blown up this past year, going undefeated, winning 5-0. Madurov right around that cusp for a top 15 as we talked about earlier. And that Zach Cummings matchup you very well could grade in the favor of Alessio, so bounced back after a couple bad breaks. Nice to see. It's a little tough for you to give next with him being on such a big skid. I know you got that Korean cat that just fought John Phillips not that long ago. I think his name is Jun Young Park. You got Kyle Dawkins, who's coming fresh off of his first win in the UFC. You got Darren Wynn doing just that, coming off a win over Antonio Arroyo. So all of which I think would be good matchups for him. With him not really being a guy that's moving the needle at this point. And it probably didn't help him any that he walked out in the post-fight press conference. So depending on if Dana's feeling some type of way about that. If he didn't take too kindly to it, Dana very well could be setting him up for failure his next time out by giving him somebody that he doesn't match up well with. Maybe you can give him Punali. That's actually not a bad matchup because you got Alessio, who's durable as hell and has never been knocked out before. Obviously, Punali has never been knocked out before because he's undefeated. Both guys hit like Mack trucks. And if Punali can pull out an impressive win over Alessio, then that gives Punali the push that he needs for his career, which at the same time would also put Alessio at losing 4 out of his last 5, which would give Dana plenty of initiative to cut him if he wanted to. Whether or not he's willing to do that after a finish like that, I'm not sure. But for the co-main, you had Li Zhangliang versus Santiago Ponzinibbio. Santiago with a very long layoff. His last fight prior to this one was against Neil Magny in 2018, to which he picked up an impressive knockout in the 4th. But since then, he has had a lot of health issues that kept him out up to this point. Actually lost his ranking due to inactivity. But in between that time, Lee has been very active and he's been showing out in a lot of his performances. Lee, including this one, winning 4 out of his last 5. His only blemish against Neil Magny. If that's not a perfect example of how MMA math don't work, I don't know what is. But Li Zhangliang with a very impressive KO victory. I believe he picked up extra $50K for that one. At this point, I definitely think Li Zhangliang has earned a rank guy. Currently right now, and I'm trying to understand and wrap my mind around why he's still at number 13. But sitting at number 13, you have Robbie Lawler. I'm somebody that's always going to tune in to Robbie fighting. He could be 60 in a wheelchair and I'll still tune in his matchups. But just below him, you got Bilal Muhammad. He slid into that 12th spot after Anthony Pettis, who chose to test the free agent market. You got Donald Cerrone that's looking to get back in the win column. That one has all the makings of being a blockbuster matchup. As for Santiago, as long as it takes for him to recover, I'd like to see him back in there as soon as possible. Obviously, you don't want him rushing back in there right away because he did just get knocked out. It'd probably be in his best interest, in all honesty, to take the full extent of his medical suspension. I'm not sure what they slapped him with. I imagine 180 days. That comes out roughly to about a half a year. And according to Faraz Sahabi, it takes roughly that amount of time for a fighter to noticeably improve. So in that period of time, look to improve upon what you can. It's tough because you almost want to give him a tune-up fight, but given he was just in the top 15, you don't want him to fall off too much, especially if he loses that fight. I can't think of anything more damaging to his career than if he were to take a fight that he was supposed to decisively win, only for him to wind up getting caught by somebody like, let's say, Christian Aguilera, who's, no disrespect to him, somewhat of a journeyman. He's only had 2 UFC bouts up to this point. As of right now, he's 1-1. And Santiago's built up quite a resume over the years. He's 9-3 in his UFC bouts. And I'd hate to see him throw all that progress away over the course of, I want to say, 7 years. I believe his debut was in 2014. All the way on one bout that was supposed to be a tune-up fight and wound up pretty much costing him his career. So if you're the UFC, maybe look to give him somebody like Mikel Pereira. A win over him would keep Santiago right around the top 15. Mikel been on quite a bit of a tear. As of right now, he's 3-2 in the UFC, but one of those losses, of course, in a fight against Diego Sanchez, where he got carried away and hit him with an illegal knee. Right up until that point, Mikel thoroughly dominated that entire fight. So if he keeps his composure, say another 2.5 minutes, he'd be looking at 4-1. And I think if he ran back that Tristan Connolly fight, he'd be a lot more conservative with his energy because he was doing a lot of backflips and a lot of big movements, as DC would call it. So Ponzinibbio can put him away. That keeps him right in the discussion. You got Chaos Williams, who just lost to Mikel Pereira maybe about a month ago. He's been trending quite a bit ever since his knockout win over Abdul Razak Al Hassan, who's an absolute fucking monster. He's got freaking detonators in both hands. And Chaos straight starched that poor man. That was, in my opinion, probably the knockout of the year. Primarily for the combination that Abdul Razak Hassan's probably the most dangerous striker as far as power in the welterweight division. He has a 100% finishing rate, all by knockout, all within the first round of the fight. And up to that point, had only lost via decision. And Chaos straight treated him like a warm-up. Put him out on his feet in one shot. So Santiago clicking a win over him would keep him right in the loop. And vice versa for Chaos Williams. If he can knock out a decorated striker like Santiago, and he's looking at about with the top 15. And lastly, you can probably give him D-Rod, Daniel Rodriguez. He coming off his first loss in the UFC, I believe. If I recall correctly, it was Nicholas Dalby. Other than that, he's only had 3 other decisions, 2 of which he lost, unfortunately. But other than that, he gets the job done pretty much every time around. So that'd be an exciting one between him and Ponzinibbio. He's right around that mid-pack in the welterweight division. So definitely if you're Santiago, take a big step back. But again, you don't want to give him too easy of an opposition. Because if that goes south, his career is pretty much done. So pretty much one of those guys, somebody that's a mid-tier, right around the top 15 guy. If not, somebody that's 1 or 2 away from really making noise in the UFC. As for the co-main, you had 2 OGs going at it. Matt Brown versus Carlos Condit. Guess third time really is the charm. I guess this is the 3rd time they've tried to make this matchup, which is actually kind of surprising considering how long both of them have been around. And you figure with 83 fights in between both of them, that both of them would have locked horns at least once before that. But finally got to make it happen. 3rd time's the charm. Carlos picking up only his 4th decision victory out of his 32. That no chalks up 2 in a row for him. Carlos is a weird one, man. Because he's one of those Andrei Arlovski types that are hanging in there. They're making it competitive. They're winning their fights. But they're not putting them away like they used to. Now, don't get it twisted. Carlos Condit's still a much more entertaining fighter than Andrei Arlovski at this point. That last fight was my final straw with Andrei. How the UFC allows a man to make $360,000, only for him to throw 32 significant strikes the entire fight. After tax, he's still making over a stack per significant strike he lands. That's fucking insane, man. If that's any other company and somebody's underperforming like that, and they're making that much money, they're shit canning them. Dana, of course, does have a soft spot for these OG guys, because they are the ones that built up the company. So he has a tough time letting go of them, because they all played such a big part in his success over the years. So he probably feels obligated to at least keep him on the payroll. I don't think anybody would feel right letting somebody sacrifice that much for you, only for you to ultimately do something like fire him and put him on the unemployment line when he's got a family, bills to pay, and overall just throwing a monkey wrench into their life. Anybody with morals would not feel right doing some shit like that. But regardless, Dana vocalized that Carlos will be getting another contract. Could not have been a more perfectly timed victory. To be honest, though, Dana kind of looked a little mad about it. I think he was hoping with that being the last fight on Carlos's contract that he was maybe going to take the L. I believe that would put him at losing 6 out of his last 7. So that'd be one less cut that Dana would have to make rather than waiving somebody's contract on the roster. This way tends to prevent any bad blood between the promoter and the fighter. Because rather than cutting a guy that's 2 fights deep into his contract with maybe 3 left, that's a bad deal. But just for example wise, somebody like Ray Borg, who unexpectedly gets cut right around Christmas time. Guys like Matt Riddle, who essentially got cut due to too many positive marijuana tests, especially with UFC changing their policy on positive marijuana tests, which is actually a story I forgot to mention earlier. I guess now under situations where the UFC acts as its own commission, which is essentially situations like Fight Island, where the UFC goes overseas. That actually probably helps in the case of if they go somewhere sketchy like Singapore, where if you pop hot for weed, they'll put you in the slammer for 2 years, bare minimum. So hopefully that acts as a clause for some of those guys. Either which way, I'm sure Dana would have enough pull to get him out regardless. This rule essentially makes it so that if the fighters pop hot for weed within a week out of their fight, I believe, maybe even sooner, I think even a day, maybe two, I think maybe weigh-ins. I'm just guessing and making shit up at this point. But all in all, guys will not be getting no contest for testing positive for marijuana anymore. Matter of fact, I hope a bunch of those fighters appeal those contests and get their wins back. For a fighter to lose their win, especially when it's not a performance-enhancing drug, is straight up bullshit. There's really no way to sugarcoat it. You're talking about guys that beat down their body on a regular basis. They're constantly playing with pain. And it is a much better alternative than them getting addicted to pain meds, which you've seen with quite a few guys around that 2010 era. This unfortunately not active in the commissions in the U.S. as of right now, but Jeff Nowitzki seems to be wanting to push that through fairly quickly. All in all, Jeff does good work. I'm willing to bet that he's going to make it a priority for the fighters. It just sucks that this is something that should have been fixed a long ass time ago, but better late than never, as they always say. But what were we talking about? Oh yeah, bad blood after being cut. So rather than a case like Matt Riddle where you have 3 mouths to feed, you have 3 children, and then out of nowhere you get this call that you no longer have a job, has openly vocalized his dislike for Dana on social media. Whereas if you got a case like Carlos Condit where he simply just runs out his contract, and then in negotiation, if there even is one, you guys don't come to an agreement, then you two just mutually part ways. It's kind of like giving your 2 weeks notice at whatever job you have. It's just a lot more clean that way. Nobody's stepping on anybody's toes. But since Condit earned himself another contract, I say maybe put him against another OG fighter. Somebody like Dirty Bird Tim Means. He's somebody that's freshly coming off a win over Mike Perry. Matter of fact, Mike Perry's another one that you can put him against. I wouldn't mind that matchup. I think Condit has the ability to pick Mike Perry apart on his feet. And although it's kind of a random, strange out the blue matchup, you got Lyman Good, who I believe is coming off of a loss. I could be wrong on that. For some reason, I think I am. But I do know he fought sometime mid last year. And although Condit has had more matchups, both the guys are actually the same age at 36. Again, Condit, I think, the much better fighter all around. As for the case of Matt Brown, I unfortunately don't think Dana's going to be willing to hold on to him. I always watch Matt Brown throw down, but with him only winning 3 out of his last 10 over the span of 7 years, which in his defense, a lot of those wins have come recently. 2-2 in his last 4. But I say with Matt Brown being the OG that he is, that the UFC just runs out his contract. Let him fight out whatever's left on his contract. That way if the UFC winds up wanting to part ways with him, Matt Brown at least has some time to prepare for the free agent market, rather than getting blindsided by a call from a matchmaker that you no longer have a job with the UFC. Just think it's a little more tasteful thing to do for somebody that's been around for so long. I'm honestly expecting to see a pair of Bellator gloves in his future. But if the UFC does end up keeping him around, you got Alex Morono, who's just coming off a loss over Anthony Pettis. Nico Price is willing to fight anybody anytime. So a nice little matchup between 2 die-by-the-sword fighters. Then you got Takashi Sato, who just took an L to Miguel Baeza, who also just recently beat Matt Brown. So with that being a mutual defeat, they're right around the same area, as far as the welterweight picture goes anyway. But again, I'm not sure how many fights Matt Brown has left on his contracts. But again, definitely see Matt Brown fighting for another promotion. Or the way Scott Coker's been scooping up UFC vets, I wouldn't be surprised if they pick up Matt Brown too if they cut him. For sure, still has name value and definitely can still move the needle, which actually might wind up being a better scenario for Matt Brown anyway, because Matt Brown being on the current streak that he's on, more than likely not going to make any title runs anytime soon, so he's battling Father Time a little bit on this one. And with him being a fighter at the tail end of his career, his primary initiative should be to make as much money as possible to potentially set him up for whatever phase of his life he plans on pursuing next. Which honestly, I could see him doing anything after fighting. He seems like one of those guys that would just pick up a blue-collar job after his fight career is over. Probably lay out pavement or some shit like that. Do like Tim Sylvia did and work for a tile and roofing company. But if he does continue fighting, Bellator would be a great fit for him, just because he'll be able to control what sponsors he signs with. He's not forced to sign with Reebok because the UFC is in a contract deal with him. This way he'll make what he's actually worth, because you figure at best he maybe has 5-6 fights left. So he's just better off getting the max value out of those fights, sign with whoever the highest bidder is. Then if you want to open your own gym, you can do so. If you want to train people, you can do so. If you want to do people's driveways for a living, you can do so. Regardless of whatever he decides to do, health and wellness to him. Have been and always will be a Matt Brown fan. Dude's a straight savage through and through. Can't recall a time he's ever been boring. And if it is his last fight, he surely will be missed. And with that, we bring you the main event of the night. Max Holloway versus Calvin Kattar. I actually went on record the last episode saying I didn't think Max was motivated as far as fighting anymore. I felt that his last couple performances, and by a couple I mean solely the Volkanovski fights, he seemed very lax, didn't seem very motivated. Almost felt that he displayed similar body language to that of Robert Whittaker after he fought Yoel Romero the second time. And I know he did essentially win the second fight. Max literally got burned so bad in that one that sportsbooks refunded bets that were on Max because it was such an unjust win for Volkanovski. And I can't recall a time in any sport where a sportsbook had enough of a conscience to refund people's bets. So that just tells you how bad the decision was. I definitely handily had Max winning the first 3 rounds, and that's excluding the 2 knockdowns that he had in the second matchup. But even still, I felt that he was, for the most part, indifferent on whether or not he won that fight. Or maybe that's how confident he was that he was going to win that fight. Either which way, he could not have proved me to be more wrong. And let me tell you, I haven't been more happy to be wrong in my life. Dana said this wasn't the best performance of Max's career. I personally disagree with that. We got to see a lot of tools in Max's game that we haven't seen in past fights. For one, the elbows that he was mixing up with the punches. Now that he's mixing those in, do not be surprised if you see him reach 500 as far as significant strikes landed. Because I'm telling you right now, I can see it now. So there's this form of kickboxing out of Cambodia. It's called Pradel Saray. But in their language, it translates out to free boxing or free fighting. But they had this specific way of striking where they throw multiple shots in one motion. And what I mean by that is, for example, they like to do it with hooks, with the overhand elbow immediately following it. That way you're essentially getting 2 strikes for the price of 1. And in the scenario where they don't make contact with the hook, they won't be expecting the elbow from the same hand following immediately after. But very lethal technique. But if Max opts to add this specific discipline to his game, this specific fighting style mixed in with his cardio base, makes for a very frightening combination. His opponents can barely get offense as it is now, due to his output being so high. He essentially makes it so that his opponent can't land a shot without having to take 3 in the process. He throws elbows in the mix with that. There ain't no way in hell that his opponents are going to have any breathing space to get anything off. Because the moment they open up with something, they're getting cracked with either an elbow, a fist. You don't really see Max throw too many head kicks, but don't be surprised if you see that follow suit. The drastic improvement Max has made between his debut when he was 20 to now has been something really special to watch. If he can beat Volkanovski in this trilogy matchup that he potentially might be getting, obviously Volkanovski has to get through Brian Ortega first. Personally, I got no problem with Max fighting either for the title. Brian Ortega really impressed me with his last showing against Korean Zombie. I didn't think there was a way in hell that Brian Ortega was going to outstrike Korean Zombie, and I could not have been more wrong. Which seems to be the theme for today. I mean, I didn't do too bad on the picks, I guess. 7 out of 10, C. Not a terrible first impression, I suppose. The worst thing I could have done for myself was maybe reverse that and get 3 out of 10. But we'll see how this week goes. A lot of picks right after this is done. 2 full cards worth. As of right now, no fights have been dropped from the Neil Magny Michael Chiesa card. That's a 14-fight marathon on ESPN, I believe. But either which way, whether Max fights Brian Ortega or Volkanovski, I think he handily takes it either which way. Brian's striking is significantly more impressive than it was initially in the first bout. But Max's is also improving drastically, which is even more scary, because he's already arguably the best striker that's ever been in the featherweight division, at least up to date. I'm going to double down by saying the only way I think Brian Ortega beats Max is by submission, which is no easy task because Max has the highest takedown defense in the featherweight division. But if Brian can at least gain Max's respect in the striking department, he'll be able to at least open up Max for the takedown. Otherwise, vice versa. If Max overcompensates for the takedown, then maybe Brian can potentially put his lights out, given that Max has never been even knocked down in his entire UFC career. And we're not talking about a measly 6-7 fights. Max has had a total of 24 UFC fights. I don't know what these damn Hawaiians are made of, but Hawaiians got some of the best chins on the planet. So I'm going to put my money on that that's going to still be the case after he fights Brian Ortega again. And if Volkanovski beats Ortega, he's going to do everything in his power to avoid the Max Holloway rematch. He put out on Twitter shortly after the fight that he wanted to close this Max Holloway book for good in his career, which essentially tells you right off the rip that he does not want the smoke. So this next time around, I think third time's the charm. I think Max breaks out the full arsenal. Hands, elbows, knees. Watch this motherfucker knock him out with a head kick after I was talking all that shit earlier. Only question is, do you give Volkanovski the immediate rematch if and when Max does beat him? Because on paper, he did successfully defend his belt against Max Holloway twice. And if Max goes on to win that one, do you continue to hold up the division and do a fifth one? Because that puts him at an even 2-2 technically. I would say no, just because there's so much controversy surrounding the second one. Because it was such an atrocious decision on the judge's part, I personally just chalk it up 3-1 for Max in the series and keep the division rolling. That's essentially what they did with Jose Aldo versus Marlon Moraes. Marlon Moraes picked up the victory, but they felt Jose Aldo won it, which resulted in Jose Aldo getting the shot at the vacant bantamweight title. So I hope they maybe do the same for this one if it does go to 4. Now in the case for Calvin Kattar, really sad sight to see, man, because it's one thing to get clipped and knocked out. Some fighters can just write that off as a mistake. But if you're in a 5-round affair and your opponent's essentially beating you for the entire 5 rounds of the fight, not to mention Max clowned the shit out of him for 2 out of the 3 rounds, literally having a conversation with the commentators while he's slipping punches, which I can't think of a bigger form of disrespect. And the worst part about that is there's nothing you can do about it, because you're trying to do something about it, and it's not working out. But this is definitely one of those fights where the guy that was on the losing end may not be the same fighter leaving the cage that he was going in. And here's what I mean. Perfect example. Rich Franklin versus David Loiseau. Rich Franklin beat the holy hell out of David Loiseau for 5 straight rounds, similar to this one. All the credit to him, but as much of a vicious striker as Rich Franklin was back in the day, that is not an easy-ass weapon to endure. He's only one of 6 guys out of the 37 that Rich Franklin has fought that have made it all the way to the distance with him. But oddly enough, I was trying to recount the time that I recalled somebody getting a 42 as far as a judge's scorecard, and I think it might have been this fight. I could be wrong. I think it might have been 46, 45. Either which way, it wasn't close. But similar narrative. Fight arguably could have been stopped in the 4th round. The ref chose to let it keep going. And from that fight forward, David Loiseau went from a guy that was 13-4, contending for a title in the UFC, to going on a 2-fight losing skid shortly after that, essentially getting cut from the UFC, bounced around the regional scene, never found his way back, and essentially retired 23-11 with no merit to his name. And this tailspin was all attributed to this matchup. Now, would his career have panned out different had he not fought Rich Franklin? Probably not, because at some point he was going to have to fight Anderson Silva, in which case he probably would have took more of a beating. But it'll be really interesting to see if this is the same case with Calvin Kattar. I sure hope it's not, but that was one that Calvin Kattar not only took a serious physical beating, but a mental one, because not only did he essentially get outclassed, when a fighter is clowning you like Max was and you can't do jack shit about it, some fighters struggle to cope with that. To be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if he loses another 1 or 2 back-to-back. I think with that being the first time that Calvin Kattar has ever really been outclassed before, so I think it's going to take a little time for him to build his confidence back. But overall, I see him bouncing back maybe in year 2022. I see him taking quite a bit of a dip on the rankings this year, but we'll see what happens. Personally, I like the idea of him maybe fighting Korean Zombie next, with Korean Zombie losing to Brian Ortega last and Calvin Kattar losing to Max Holloway. Both guys potentially fighting for the title next time around, so this may be determining who sticks around in that top 5 spot and who drops down in the middle of the pack. You got Josh Emmett right beneath him at number 7. Personally, if you're Calvin Kattar, I wouldn't go any farther than that on the rankings, only because if his confidence is shot and he does take a loss, That very well could snowball into the downward spiral that we talked about, because you got guys at a number 11 like Sadiq Youssef that can absolutely crack, who has all the capability of potentially fighting for a title someday. Arnold Allen, another nightmare people haven't found a solution for yet, and still getting better. And at number 12, Shane Burgos was a guy that gave Calvin Kattar fits their first outing. So a lot of potential killers that could botch his career if he's not careful. So if you're Calvin Kattar, best thing to do, as of right now, you got a 180-day medical suspension, guaranteed. So it'll take a lot of time to work on your game, not just as far as physical tools in your arsenal, but first and most importantly, make sure his mind's right before he gets back in there. Maybe frequently visit a sports psychologist or a hypnotist, one of the two. Pick up meditation, yoga, whatever he has to do to get his mind right. Just as long as he isn't lying to himself and pushing himself back in there quicker than he should be. But it'll be interesting to see whether or not he takes that tailspin that we just talked about, or whether or not he bounces back. Hopefully he does. It would be tough to say with that string of killers whether or not he actually sees a title shot in his career, but hopefully he gets at least one crack at it before he's done. You never know what's going to happen down the line. A good chunk of us remember a time when Chuck Liddell had this legendary chin. Next thing you know, takes one vicious shot from Rashad Evans, then winds up losing 3 straight by knockout after that. So no matter how great the chin, it's got to go at some point. Who's to say down the line Max won't show similar deterioration? In which case, Calvin Kattar always a dangerous striker, and the last thing to go with a fighter is always the power. So never know what's down the line, maybe 4 or 5 years from now. Both guys relatively young, not even in their prime yet, which is wild considering how much Max has accomplished already. But still a very long way to go for both fighters. And with that, we bring our recap to a close. Finish it off with the picks for this week. Just got 2 cards to sound off real quick, and then we'll bring the second episode to a close. Again, listeners, thank y'all so much for listening. Blessings to all y'all. Hopefully y'all like this one as much as the first one, if not more. Definitely think despite the time crunch, this one went a lot more smoother. A lot less technical difficulties. Like I said, I plan on fixing the beginning of the first one. Those tiny little glitchy sections are only in the opening minutes of the episode. The rest of the episode is clean cut, so just got to go in and tweak it some and then upload the refresh version, and voila. But anyway, we'll cut that range short so I don't go down a rabbit hole. Leading off tomorrow's card, Chiesa versus Magny, UFC on ESPN 20. As it looks right now, no fights have been dropped from this card. All good signs there. No obscene weight misses, no COVID positive tests. Almost seems too good to be true, knock on wood. But leading off this card, which starts at 9 a.m. in the morning, not a huge fan of that time start, but nothing a coffee won't fix. Crack open that Cinnamon Toast Crunch Creamer that I got, kick back and relax. But leading off that card, you have Manon Foyet versus Victoria Leonardo. Manon, a very talented kickboxer out of France, making her UFC debut at 5-1. But overall opposition thus far, she hasn't really faced anybody that's really tested her yet. And Victoria Leonardo has a way better resume than she does. Actually earned her contract off of the Contender Series, so right off the rip, facing an opponent of a very high caliber in Chelsea Hackett. So I definitely think this will be a good learning experience for Manon. Probably end up being a slight step back, but I definitely think the experience of Victoria Leonardo is going to get it done for her. With Lenon's lack of grappling pedigree, and Victoria Leonardo being a very talented, well-rounded artist, I see her maybe scoring the takedown and getting a submission in either the first or second round. Second, you got cousin of Khabib Nurmagomedov, Umar Nurmagomedov, making his UFC debut against Sergey Morozov. Umar, much like his cousin, very talented grappler, also undefeated at 12-0. More specifically, has a phenomenal rear naked choke. 4 of his 5 submission wins are by rear naked choke. And it just so happens that Sergey's 3 submission losses are all by rear naked choke. I doubt that that's a coincidence. Sergey being a guy that's out of Kazakhstan more known for producing some of the best boxers on the planet, hasn't really caught up to the rest of the world as far as the grappling goes. And I always say, when in doubt, go with the Russian. So I'm going to have Umar taking it in the second round by a rear naked choke. Third up, you got Mike Davis taking on Mason Jones. Mason Jones undefeated at 10-0, making his UFC debut. Mason Jones, the most recent Cage Warriors lightweight champ, Fairly well-rounded. Has his finishes pretty much split right down the middle. 4 TKO finishes with 3 submission wins. But with this being his UFC debut, and the crowds, of course, coming back into play, there's bound to be some octagon jitters. And Mike Davis is a very lethal fighter. Has dynamite in both hands. Can carry that power deep into the third round. Has a damn good cardio base. You really don't have to look much further than the Thomas Gifford knockout. That was actually kind of a tough one to watch. I believe that ref actually lost a job over that one too, if I'm not mistaken. Rightfully so, because I don't think Thomas Gifford has fought since then. All of Mike Davis's wins have been by finish. He's only been finished once out of his 2 losses. That by submission against a very talented jiu-jitsu artist, Hebert Burns. That'd be brother of Gilbert Burns. He is the most recent opposition of Kamaru Usman, the welterweight champ. So no shame in getting caught in that one. Mason Jones, although a good grappler, I don't think is quite up to the par of Hebert Burns. And I think the combination of octagon jitters mixed with Mike Davis being a killer is going to be a lot for Mason Jones to take on too soon. I think he might hold his own for a little bit, but I think Mike Davis is going to pick it up by a KO finish in the second round. Fourth up, you have Francisco Figueiredo taking on Jerome Rivera. Francisco is brother of Davison Figueiredo, that is the flyweight champ in the UFC. So a very good sparring partner to have in training camp. Jerome Rivera, a very talented 25-year-old. Very good on the ground, but has really struggled as far as getting out of his own way as far as breaking through in the UFC. His first opportunity came in the Contender Series, which he won his matchup. That was by unanimous decision. Dana thought it'd be a good idea to give him a little more experience on the regional circuit, which didn't even end up happening. They ended up just offering him a contract anyway. So I don't know why you'd give the poor kid blue balls just to give him a contract anyway. Nonetheless, he fought Tyson Nam in his debut. And Tyson Nam, a very cagey, experienced vet, has over 30 fights. Extremely underrated due to his record. More or less a journeyman, has 20 wins and 11 defeats. But very underrated knockout artist, has scored 12 out of his 20 wins by TKO finish. Jerome Rivera is still very early in his development. Tyson Nam, being so experienced, has probably already seen what Jerome Rivera has to offer. So he was able to figure out a game plan for him fairly quickly. So Jerome really struggling to keep a foothold in the UFC. I thought Dana was right in him maybe taking more regional scene fights, build up his experience, get more development. In which case you could be seeing a similar situation that you saw with Uriah Hall, where the kid getting a push too early and giving him a bunch of fights that he's not ready for. Because although Figueiredo doesn't seem like a big package to deal with, just being around his brother and training with him every day, and his brother being the champ in the division just below him, and Figueiredo very big for his weight class, arguably could be a 35er, potentially might be fighting Henry Cejudo at 35. So I think that's going to make all the difference. Iron sharpens iron. So for that reason, I have Figueiredo picking up a submission victory in the second round. Fifth, you got Marcus Perez versus Dulce Lungiabula. Marcus predominantly good on the ground, but much rather strike with his opponent. Probably not the best case against Dulce, so I look for that jiu-jitsu background to play a big factor in this fight. Dulce in his 12 fights has actually never seen a grappler yet. So I think as long as Marcus can manage to get Dulce on the ground at least once, I think that's all it'll take, because I don't think he's going to know the proper defenses to Marcus's techniques. So for that reason, I have a submission going to Marcus in the first round. Sixth up, you got Zaruk Adashev versus Sue Mudieri. I don't know what the UFC is trying to do to this poor kid Adashev, man. Dude came in the UFC at 3-1, hardly had any experience. Another guy that took on Tyson Nam. That resulted in Tyson Nam picking up the KO victory in 30 seconds. So why the hell they would double down and give Adashev fucking Sue Mudieri? Mudieri, absolute fucking assassin from China. So why the UFC would double down and give Adashev a much better striker the second time around is beyond me. But somebody don't give a fuck about that boy's health. If Adashev was a grappler, that'd be one thing. Because Mudieri's Achilles heel has shown to be grappling. All 4 of his losses have been by submission. But Adashev a kickboxer, and he's shown that he's not ready for the UFC at this point in time. So hopefully this time around he realizes he needs to take a step back. So to me, this one's a no-brainer. I have Sue Mudieri taking this one by first round knockout. 7th, you got Ricky Simone taking on Gaetano Perillo. Poirier making his UFC debut. Ricky Simon recently removed from the bantamweight rankings. Currently 16-3. Predominantly a fairly dangerous striker. More or less hurt you with volume, not power. Gaetano, very dangerous hands. Actually a whole weight class above Ricky Simon. At least what he typically fights anyway. Ricky Simon normally a 35er. But that size difference could play a huge factor. Poirier's weakness has shown to be on the ground, and Ricky Simon not necessarily the best in that department. Only 2 of his 16 wins are by submission. So with a combination of that size advantage and the power that Poirier has, although it is his UFC debut, I have Poirier getting it done in the second round by knockout. Just because I think that size advantage will be too much to handle. I think he'll bully him pretty much the entire time from start to finish. But we'll see what happens. 8th up in what I think is the start of the main card, you have Omari Akhmedov versus Tom Breeze. Tom Breeze a little up and down at this point, but still like what I've seen out of him in the last couple contests. He's only lost to Shane Strickland and Brendan Allen, who are both ranked at one point in time, so no shame there. Akhmedov has shown to be prone to be finished in the past, and Tom Breeze a very talented finishing artist, more so actually on the ground than in the stand-up. But had a very good KO victory his last time around, showed a lot of power, very sharp technical kickboxing. Omari does have very good wrestling though, with him being Dagestani and all. He's a guy that'll hurt you on the feet, but not very often, predominantly a ground and pound guy. Has pretty good submission ability, very good IQ on the ground. But because both guys are very efficient there, I think that'll cancel out in both fighters, making it more of a stand-up war. In which case, Tom Breeze has the much more cleaner, sharper striking, and Omari Akhmedov much more susceptible to being knocked out. So I have Tom Breeze maybe getting in the 3rd round, because I don't think it's going to be easy affair. But with a combination of exhaustion and Tom Breeze's ability to hold power in all 3 rounds, and Tom Breeze has an excellent body kick, so for some reason, I want to say 3rd round knockout by body kick. Pat 9th, you got Laron Murphy. Laron, a very talented kickboxer. I believe he's undefeated. Undefeated with 1 draw. He's taking on Douglas Andrade. Douglas, a very talented Barboza type out of Brazil. But Douglas very inactive. His last fight was against Renan Barão in 2019. Went all the way to a decision with him. And it's at a point where Renan is at the back end of his career. You want to talk about another guy that got altered after a fight? That first TJ Dillashaw matchup where he got finished in the 5th. That one was a tough one to watch. TJ took a piece of Renan Barão's soul that day. Potentially with the help of some supplements, but that's neither confirmed nor denied. If he did, very piece of shit thing to do. But what can you do? That's the fight game. But before that, his last fight was against champ Peter Yan. He lost that one by corner stoppage in 2018. So fairly long streaks of inactivity. And in that matchup with Peter Yan, I thought he could have kept going. I don't feel that he was hurt to the point where he couldn't continue. But then again, I'm not Douglas, so I don't know his pain threshold. I don't know what was wrong with him. But that tells me psychologically that he's more willing to break if he's not playing the bully. And with Laron being the bigger fighter at 45, Douglas sure as hell is not going to be the bully in this one. And the slight chance where Douglas does grapple with Laron, which I don't even know if he does jiu-jitsu. He's a Brazilian, so I'd imagine. Tends to break my heart when I see a Brazilian that doesn't, because that's literally the motherland of grappling. There's probably a jiu-jitsu school every 2 blocks, although Brazil does go through recession, so a lot of people may not be able to afford them. But regardless of whatever the case may be, Laron already proven against a very good jiu-jitsu artist in Ricardo Ramos. And Ricardo has fought as big as 55. So I like Laron's chances in this one. I don't see him getting the finish though. Douglas very durable. That is, as long as he doesn't quit on the stool again. Not bashing him, just throwing that out as a possibility. Because Douglas is very durable. And for that reason, I think Laron's going to take him all the way to a decision. But I think he's going to win all 3 rounds, no problem. Coming at that 10th spot, you got Matt Snell. He's taking on Tyson Nam. He's a guy whose name's been popping up throughout the night. Just goes to show you don't have to be able to talk a whole heap of shit to be successful in UFC. As long as you got a nice body of work, you could still make it tough for people to keep your name out your mouth. But Matt Schnell, a guy that's predominantly a grappler. He's a guy that over half his wins are by submission, 8 out of his 14 to be exact. Tyson Nam, your typical hard-hitting Hawaiian. Of Tyson Nam's 32 fights, he has never been submitted, so not exactly an easy task for Matt Schnell. Matt Schnell on the flip side has been knocked out 3 times, with 12 of Tyson Nam's 20 wins come by way of knockout. You could probably look to see him put Matt Schnell away fairly early. I'd say probably mid-second round. Matt Schnell, not exactly a guy that's going to put your lights out. Has only 2 TKO finishes. And Tyson Nam has only been knocked out 3 times over the course of his career, all by very talented knockout artists. One being top 5 bantamweight Marlon Moraes, another being former UFC vet Russell Duan, and one time by Mark Ashiro, who never cracked the UFC, but still a very talented finisher. Has finished all but one of his wins. So Tyson Nam really only been put out by the best as far as knockout artists go. So I don't think Schnell's going to have enough power to gain Tyson Nam's respect. So for that reason, I think Tyson Nam's going to keep an intense pace, ultimately wear him out. My guess, like I said, somewhere in the second round by a TKO finish. At 11th, you got Viviane Araújo versus Roxanne Modafferi. Roxanne been doing this shit for a hot minute, goddamn. I can't think of any female other than her that has 42 fucking professional fights. There's barely even that many 125ers in that division. But of Roxanne's 25 wins, she's looking at 9 finishes total, 4 TKO finishes with 5 submissions. Roxanne's somebody that since she's been through so many matchups, they've taken a toll on her quite a bit, had quite a few surgeries. Both her knees pretty much shot. Same pretty much goes for her shoulders. So she's not able to get the same pop as some of the fighters with maybe 10 or 11 fights on the record. Viviane, a very talented all-around Brazilian martial artist. Seems to be predominantly a stand-up artist, although most of her wins have come by way of submission. Has shown excellent Muay Thai in all of her previous UFC bouts. Honestly, haven't really seen too much of her ground game. But Roxanne, with as much experience as she has, somebody that's not easily finished. Only been finished a total of 4 times, and again, that's out of 42 professional fights. That's once by knockout, 3 times by submission. And just for Roxanne to get KO'd that one time, it essentially took Sarah Kaufman slamming her on her head to do it. I do think Viviane's the much more talented stand-up artist. Not to mention Viviane a lot more agile, a lot better ability to cut angles. So if Viviane doesn't put her out between 15, I can definitely see her picking apart Roxanne through all 3. So I have Viviane putting in by a unanimous decision. 12th in the lineup, you got Isaac Villanueva taking on Vinicius Moreira. I imagine this is going to be a loser goes home match. Both guys seeking their first win in the UFC. Good news is one of them's going to get it. Unfortunately for the other one, odds are probably going to be looking for another promotion. Isaac Villanueva, more or less a brawler, will fight you pretty much at any weight. Has fought as small as 185 and as high as heavyweight. Finnick is a polar opposite. Finnick is a submission artist. 8 of his 9 wins have been by submission, although he does have 1 knockout on his record. So somebody that might put your lights out if you're not careful. Villanueva, a German that's very prone to getting stopped within the distance. 10 of his 11 losses have been by finish. Pretty much an even split. 5-5 each way. Problem is for Vinicius, he has been knocked out 3 times in a row. And Isaac has 14 knockout victories out of 17. So this one's really a coin flip. It's a matter of if Isaac can either find his chin first, or if Vinny can close the distance in order to get a takedown on him and seal the deal with a submission victory. All 3 of Vinicius' knockout losses have been fairly early in the first round. So psychologically, you got to figure that's going to wear on Vinny some. And although Isaac has lost both his UFC bouts, he's been pretty much in both of them. The first one with Chase Sherman, both guys hurt each other. In that Jordon Ray matchup, he got cut, unfortunately, very early in the fight. So you got to figure that hindered him quite a bit. Actually wound up stopping the fight. So you got to figure mentally he's probably hungry and eager to prove himself. And in a sport where your mentality is everything, I got to go with a more confident fighter. I'm going to go with Isaac Villanueva. Given how hot he comes out the gate, and given Vinny's recent history, I say Isaac gets it done in the first round. For the co-main, you got Warley Alves taking on Moner Lazzez. Moner, a late replacement for Christian Aguilera. This is a much more intriguing matchup in my mind. Monair had a very good showing in his debut against a very dangerous Abdul Razak Al Hassan. Took that one by decision, so it speaks volumes on his durability and his chin. Monair only lost one, that in a 5-round affair. So you have to figure that's because he's never seen championship rounds before. A little bit of a learning curve. I imagine he's fixed since then. A good lesson to learn before getting to the big leagues. Haven't really seen too much of what he can do on the ground. Does train at a Team Nogueira in Dubai. Who the coach out of that camp is, I'm not sure. Rolyav is a fairly dangerous kickboxer in his own right. Nowhere near the threat that Abdul Razak Al Hassan was, though. Primarily a grappling threat. And like I said, we haven't seen much of what Monair can do on the ground yet. With it being a Nogueira affiliate gym, I imagine he's somewhat decent. So I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark because I don't know for sure. I'm going to go with Mounir Laziz via unanimous decision. But again, wild stab in the dark, not very sure on that one. And lastly, you got the main event, Michael Chiesa versus Neil Magny. Neil Magny, much more experienced with championship rounds. Oftentimes goes to a decision anyway. Very good output on his end. Trains at Team Elevation with Curtis Blades and Justin Gagey. So you got to figure a good takedown defense on his end. And Michael Chiesa, of course, recently moving up to welterweight after fighting at light heavyweight for quite a while. Chiesa, a much smaller fighter than Magny. Chiesa for sure has the grappling advantage, but I think Neil Magny has the defense to counteract it. And without Chiesa being able to go to his grappling wheelhouse, Neil Magny with a clear-cut striking advantage. Now it's tough to see how Michael Chiesa will react because he's never been in a 5-round fight before, or whether or not the combination between that and Neil Magny's pace will wear on him. So I could see Neil Magny potentially either picking him apart or him maybe getting the 4th round knockout victory due to Michael Chiesa maybe gassing himself out, not being used to the championship rounds. All in all, I think it'll be a good learning curve for Michael Chiesa. Don't get me wrong, he does have a decent chance of winning it. Neil Magny has been submitted 4 times out of his 7 losses. But those coming out the hands of guys like Damian Maia, Sergio Moraes, Rafael Dos Anjos, all of which are high-ranked black belts. Chiesa only a brown belt last I knew. I say only as if it's not hard as fuck to do. But it'll be interesting to see how good his grappling really is. But I think the experience in the later rounds is going to make all the difference for Neil Magny. Neil Magny, a guy that never gets tired. And Chiesa only being in 3-round fights and having shown a lot of fatigue in those 3-round fights. Look to see him get finished in either the 3rd or 2nd round by a TKO. And with that, we jump right into the big ticket. UFC 257. Dustin Poirier versus Conor McGregor 2. This one actually didn't intrigue me that much at first. But as it's gotten closer, and the more I thought on it, it has been 7 years since their last matchup. A lot of time has passed since then. Dustin Poirier, a brand new fighter pretty much. A much improved fighter. So it'll be interesting to see his growth from 2014 to now. And how that knockout loss has psychologically affected Dustin Poirier. Whether or not he can mentally overcome it or whether or not it's going to linger in his mind. Personally, I think once Conor McGregor's in your head, I think he's living in there rent-free the remainder of your life. Or at least the remainder of your fight career. I'm sure you can find several fighters who their loss to Conor McGregor has kept them up at night. But this weekend we'll finally figure out whether or not that knockout loss was a fluke, or whether or not Conor McGregor actually has his number. But before we get into all that, kicking off the night you have Amir Alabazi taking on Zhalgas Zhumagulov. Zhumagulov, a Kazakhstani, predominantly a boxer. Very heavy-handed, but in the flyweight division. This matchup he's making his debut at 35. But Alabazi, a straight killer, 13-1, with all but one of his wins come by way of finish. So with the combination of the size advantage and Alabazi's finishing ability, and like we discussed earlier with Kazakhstan, he's not exactly having the best grappling. I imagine Alabazi's probably going to pick up the submission victory sometime in the 1st round. Second, you have Nick Lentz. He's taking on Movsar Evloev. Movsar, as you figured, another undefeated Dagestani Russian, predominantly a wrestler. He is currently 2-0 in the UFC. He had a good run last time around against Mike Grundy, who's a very good grappler, very strong. Grundy is, however, a featherweight, Nick Lentz is actually a 55er. A little on the smaller end, but very dense, very stocky. Been through the ringer, very experienced. Nick Lentz has 44 total fights. And believe it or not, I think he's seen enough, has been around long enough, and seen enough elite competition that he'll be able to handle whatever's in Masvidal's repertoire, especially with him being the smaller fighter. Nick Lentz also very good on the ground and very good off of his back if he does get taken down. And on the feet, he's a straight killer. So believe it or not, I have this one being a lot closer than one might think. I actually have Nick Lentz maybe taking this one by a second round submission. I just think he has such a lethal all-around game to where Masvidal hasn't seen enough. Yes, he's undefeated, but he's only faced Enrique Barzola, who is a good striker, but it doesn't really show much on the ground. And then Mike Grundy, who's a good grappler, but not necessarily the best striker. This is his first time that he's really had both in the same package, so that could potentially be a little bit overwhelming for Masvidal. So I'm going to go with the underdog. I got Nick Lentz, second round submission. Third up, you got Mahmoud Madurov versus Andrew Sanchez. We talked about this one earlier. Andrew Sanchez is a very sneaky stand-up fighter. Had a very shocking first-round victory over Wilmington Turman last time around, in a fight that he was very heavily predicted to lose. Andrew Sanchez, one of those underdogs that you can never count out of a fight. Pretty much a gambler's worst nightmare if you bet against him. Although he does like to stand and bang, he does have a good overall game. Pretty good catch wrestler. Knowledgeable enough on the ground. I don't think he's going to need it in this fight, though. Madurov, predominantly a boxer. Actually is managed and mentored by the great Floyd Money Mayweather. So if you want an idea on how good Madurov's hands are, there you go. So in a straight stand-up fight, you'd probably look to have Madurov win it. But with there being so many variables, and Andrew Sanchez having such a complete game, although he has been knocked out quite a few times, he's one of those guys that can resurrect from the dead after being hurt, and a guy Madurov can accidentally gas himself against if he's not careful. Although Madurov is an exceptional boxer, his game is shown to be one-dimensional at this moment. He's only had one UFC victory, that over Travis Smith, and that was a fight where if Travis Smith had a little bit more power in his hands, he might have been able to put Madurov out. Travis Smith was connecting with the chin quite frequently, and if Andrew can manage to do that this time around, it very well could be a short night for Madurov. So I actually think Madurov's going to underestimate Andrew Sanchez, as most do, and I think Andrew Sanchez is going to get the sneaky first-round knockout victory. Gotta remember, the man wanted the Ultimate Fighter for a reason. At fourth, you got Khalil Roundtree taking on Marcin Prachnio. This one going to be a slugfest as long as it lasts. Both guys stand-up artists through and through. Khalil Roundtree has recently been doing most of his camps at Tiger Muay Thai. What he did for this camp, with most of the restrictions, I'm not quite sure. I believe Thailand still got a lot of travel restrictions. Prachnio also dangerous with his hands. 10 of his 13 wins are by knockout. But of his 5 losses, 4 of those are by knockout. So you got to figure he's a guy that's willing to take one to give one. Tends to get a little more wild with his striking. Khalil Roundtree a lot more poise, a lot more discipline. Has looked phenomenal since transitioning to Tiger Muay Thai. Even if he was forced to maybe switch camps for this fight, I think he's developed enough to the point where he has enough tools to take on Marcin and pull out the victory handily. And one has to remember, Khalil Roundtree, of course, did beat Gokhan Saki, who is a world-renowned kickboxer. Hall of Fame status even. I'm not actually sure if they even have one. I'm willing to bet you can find that shit somewhere in Amsterdam. But if you can pull out a knockout victory over an impressive striking legend like Gokhan Saki, then I'm sure he'll have no problem taking on Marcin Prachnio, or Prachnio rather. I'm not sure which. My apologies, Polish people. But with him throwing caution in the wind like he does, definitely look for this one to end fairly quickly, but be a fun one for as long as it lasts. Khalil Roundtree, first round. Fifth up, you got Juliana Pena versus Sarah McMahon. Juliana Pena recently coming off her title eliminator with Germaine de Randamie. She had the misfortune of being Germaine de Randamie's first submission win ever, according to people she trains with, despite being a kickboxer from the Netherlands. She apparently has a very good guillotine of all things. Regardless, kind of an alarming look. Then again, of course, that would probably catch anybody off guard. With 0 submission victories, who do you think would figure? Hindsight, of course, is 2020. Juliana, though, much more powerful hands, much better striking. Both girls fairly even on the ground, although Sarah McMahon is a little more susceptible to getting submitted. Has 5 total submission losses. Juliana can pretty much finish you anywhere. Does have some know-how on the ground, but similar narrative. Half of her losses are by submission. Her only having 2, though. So if you ask me, Juliana Pena just barely edges out Sarah McMahon as far as all skill categories go. So I'm not quite sure in what fashion. I'm willing to bet both females will be cautious of each other, and it'll probably go to decision. I'm thinking maybe a split decision this time around. For the prelim main event, you got Brad Tavares taking on Antonio Carlos Jr. Brad Tavares, another hard-hitting Hawaiian out of Extreme Couture, kind of like Punele Soriano. Only I say a little more lighter, maybe quicker on his feet, a lot less dense, but carbon copy style of fighting. Excellent takedown submission defense, has never been submitted in his entire career. You're looking at about 24, 25 plus fights. Antonio Carlos Jr., not somebody that's exactly going to threaten you with his hands, but if he can get you in his world on the ground, he can finish you in 1,000 different ways. Antonio Carlos Jr., a BJJ world champ, I believe in no-gi, but I think Antonio Carlos Jr. is going to have a lot of trouble finding offense in this fight. Extreme Couture specializes in takedown defense. If Antonio Carlos Jr. can't take him down, with him having no knockout victories, the thing I'd advise him not to do is stand and bang with a Hawaiian, but he might have no other option in the matter. I think in the first round, Brad Tavares is going to demoralize Anthony Carlos Jr. because he can't find an opening. The second round, he's going to come in discouraged, a little less hopeful of winning. From that point on, Brad Tavares is probably going to crack him with some serious leather. So either third or second round TKO victory, maybe even a corner stoppage. That, of course, in the favor of Brad Tavares. 7th, you have Arman Tuksurian versus Nasrat Hasparat. Nasrat, a power puncher at a TriStar MMA. That is the gym run by Viras Ahabi, the coach of the greatest all-time George St. Pierre. Probably one of the top 5 most renowned gyms in the world. So even though 3/4 of his wins are by knockout, Viras isn't one of those coaches that's going to let one of his guys be weak in any certain area. He's very efficient at plugging guys' holes and fine-tuning their skill sets. But Arman's looking to be very special on. Has won 2 out of his 3 UFC fights, but all 3 very tough opposition. His 2 wins are over Davi Ramos and Oliver Aben Mercier. Davi Ramos, an Abu Dhabi world champ, so a very talented grappler. Oliver Aben Mercier, also a fighter that comes out of TriStar Gym. Oliver predominantly a wrestler, though. Arman took him to a unanimous decision. His only blemish against Islam Makhachev, who I'm not sure why you would give for somebody's debut. Maybe that just shows how high the UFC is on this kid. He has shown a very impressive skill set at age 24. And he's proven that he can handle guys that have come out of the TriStar World Gym, of course, with being Oliver Aben Mercier. Oliver, I believe, to be the much more talented fighter at TriStar Gym anyway. So he has a little idea what Viras' teachings are like, which gives him a blueprint to work off of, which makes him even more dangerous. And like I always say, when in doubt, go with the Russian. Arman Tuksurian, probably taking home another unanimous decision victory, but probably a very dominant one at that. 8th up, you got Morena Rodriguez taking on Amanda Ribas. Amanda getting a little more traction after beating Paige Van Zandt. Also managed to pick up a victory over Mackenzie Dern, which is no easy task. Amanda's only blemish was 1 knockout via Paulina Viana. That came in the first round. So a power puncher could vote to be a problem for her. And with Morena being a similar style of fighter, having 5 KO wins out of 12, also only losing 1, that would be a decision. So Morena also the much more durable fighter. It's really a matter of how good Morena Rodriguez is on the ground, and whether or not she can counteract the grappling of Amanda Ribas. If she can negate that successfully, then I think she'll have no problem picking her apart, potentially even finish her, probably midway through the second round. And if I have to choose between a fighter that's never been finished and a fighter that has been, I'm going to pick the fighter that has gone the distance every single time. So, Morena Rodriguez, second round TKO victory. At 9th, you have Ottoman Zaitar. He's taking on Matt Frivola. Ottoman, an undefeated Moroccan kickboxer. I believe he fights out of Germany, though. Has pretty much been a mercenary early on, picking over 2 first-round KO victories. One over Timu Paklian, the other over Kama Worthy. But for that reason, we haven't seen too much as far as takedown defense. Matt Frivola, predominantly a grappler. But Matt's not somebody that has a lot of power in his hands. So with Ottoman being a kickboxer, he might find Matt Frivola attempting to strike with him kind of adorable. Don't get it twisted, Matt's not afraid to throw with anybody. But with him having only 1 knockout victory, probably not the best idea when you're facing an undefeated kickboxer. Best to not let your ego get the best of you on that one. So it's really whether or not Frivola can stick to a solid game plan, exploit his strengths. Overall, I think Frivola's going to have trouble closing the distance on him. I think Ottoman's power is really going to catch Frivola's attention. And Matt Frivola has been viciously knocked out before. That against Marco Polo Reyes. That coming in the opening 30 seconds of the bout. So he's shown if you can touch his chin on the right spot, then you can definitely get him to drop. And with this being Ottoman's specialty, I see that happening in similar fashion, probably somewhere in the first 2 minutes of the first round. For the co-main, you got Jessica Ide taking on Joanne Calderwood. Joanne Calderwood coming off a loss over Jennifer Maia. That I believe was a title eliminator bout for who fights Shevchenko next. Jessica Ide coming off of a 5-round decision loss over Cynthia Calvillo. Loss or not, good display of endurance on her end. Jessica Ide, not somebody that's going to put you away, but somebody that's going to pick you apart the entire 15 to 25 that she's in there. Pretty good wrestler, pretty decent cage work. Jessica Ide also not somebody that you can put away very easy. She's only been finished twice out of 23 fights. One of those being to Valentina Shevchenko, the champ. So although she's not going to put you out within the 15, she's also shown that she's not going anywhere the entire 15. Joanne definitely has the better finishing capability. Both girls tend to win the bulk of their decisions. Joanne is susceptible to submissions, having lost 3 of her 5 in that fashion. But Jessica Ide more than likely not going to do that, with only 1 of her wins being via submission. Although you never do know. Of course, how many fights later did Germaine Duranamy get her first submission win? So, who's to say? But both girls having similar gas tanks, and Joanne hitting just a little bit harder than Jessica Ide. She's either A, going to wear the damage a lot less than Jessica Ide, which ultimately will win her the rounds, or B, she's going to get the finish in either the second or third. More likely by decision, though. Jessica Ide, not somebody that you're going to take down. She's another Extreme Couture alum. So I'd probably look to see Joanne Calderwood edge out the split decision victory. As for the co-main, you got Michael Chandler making his UFC debut. He is the former Bellator lightweight champ. He's taking on Dan Hooker, who's an absolute savage. Not an easy first test by any means. But with him being from Bellator, I don't see him having an easy road at all. I think Dan is eager to prove that the UFC is head and shoulders above all other promotions. And what better way to do that than take your most recent lightweight champ, feed him to our top 4, top 5 guy, give him the worst possible matchup for his style of fighting, which is exactly what Dan Hooker is. An absolutely filthy kickboxer out of City Kickboxing in New Zealand. City Kickboxing was 2019's Gym of the Year after producing 2 UFC world champs, Israel Adesanya and Alexander Volkanovski. And with Izzy being Dan Hooker's main training partner, and arguably the best striker that's ever touched the UFC octagon, and still further improving. And Izzy, although he hasn't shown it, not to be fucked with on the ground. I saw on Instagram that he got his blue belt recently. That under Andre Galvao, who's a very prestigious Brazilian jiu-jitsu practitioner. He does not hand out blue belts to anybody. You have to earn them shits. Not all belts are created equal, and he's one that's a very high-end, top-shelf one. So with Dan Hooker having to be in bad scenarios day in, day out, both in grappling and in striking, if you can hold your own with arguably the best striker in the game, and he fights a whole 30 pounds heavier than you, not to mention has a serious reach advantage. So I'm willing to bet that Dan Hooker's seen everything that Michael Chandler is about to throw at him on the feet. That and then some. It's probably almost elementary at that point. Is he a straight up alchemist in the stand-up? Michael Chandler's best bet would be his wrestling. Ground and pound, take him down, wear him out. but nobody's successfully been able to do that to Dan Hooker yet. Not even Gilbert Burns, who's a very talented jiu-jitsu artist, world champ even. So I don't see why Michael Chandler would be able to offer anything different in that department. And Dan Hooker only been finished one time out of 29 fights, I want to say. If I'm not mistaken, the only time that he's ever been knocked out was by Edson Barboza, and that took 3 rounds of an inhumane ass whooping. Dan Hooker has a will that most people do not have. He can venture in a place in his mind that most people cannot. The only thing I will say against Dan Hooker is that he does keep his hands very low, almost welcomes people to punch him in the face, which I don't think is the best defensive strategy. I hope he since fixed that, because that's not going to last forever. Australian or not, that chin's got to go at some point. I just don't think it's going to be this time around. So I'm going to pick Dan Hooker, taking it 3rd round knockout. And of course, very last but not least, we have Conor McGregor taking on Dustin Poirier for the 2nd time. Conor McGregor coming off an impressive win over Donald Cerrone, which doesn't carry as much merit as it used to nowadays, but still a very impressive win. Dustin just recently got back in the win column over Dan Hooker in a 5-round affair. That was shortly after losing the interim world title to Khabib Nurmagomedov. But with Khabib being the anomaly that he is, that's essentially what you're signing up for, is to take a loss. After that Gaethje win, I'm thoroughly convinced that there's not a damn person on this planet that can beat him. Definitely think if Khabib wanted to, he could definitely win a title at 170, but we'll get into that in another episode. Conor, for the most part, been inactive, and why would you be active when you got as much money as he does? But if you are placing a bet on him, it is somewhat alarming, because as the great Marvin Hagler once said, it's hard to get up and run when you're sleeping in silk sheets. And knowing Conor, his sheets are probably made out of some endangered animal. Chinchillas, maybe. But regardless, with the cozy lifestyle that he's been living, it is not the same Conor that fought Dustin Poirier in 2014. That had a much more hungry, a lot more broke Conor McGregor. That was back at a time when he was trying to prove a statement. And in the span of that 7 years, Dustin's been pretty much at the grindstone every single day. And 7 years is a very long time to catch up to somebody, especially when they may not be doing it as consistent or even part-time. And Dustin's 100% committed, even more so with Khabib out of the lightweight division. That puts the undisputed lightweight title up for grabs for anybody. So on the low, we essentially got a lightweight Grand Prix going. I don't know why Dana just wouldn't announce it as such, because a UFC Grand Prix would be absolutely fire. This would have been the perfect division to do it too, because there's not a division with more depth than the UFC. But from rankings 1 to 8, you can make a very nice Grand Prix out of that. As of right now, you got Khabib still, but that's subject to change. So let's exclude him for now. So essentially you got Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Charles Oliveira, Conor McGregor, Tony, even though he's taking a little bit of a skid, Dan Hooker, especially if he wins this one, Rafael Dos Anjos, who recently just got back in the win column, and at number 8 you got the Irish Dragon Paul Felder, who has been taking a couple L's but also has been taking very risky fights. Actually fought Rafael Dos Anjos in his most recent matchup, which was a 5-round fight, and I believe less than a week's notice. This at a time where all gyms are shut down. So the man's a straight up savage out of Philly. Philly stand up. I fucking love it out there. But with this recent vacancy, this definitely puts a lot of new life into Dustin Poirier. A lot of rejuvenated motivation. Although you can't help but wonder whether or not that knockout loss over Conor is lingering in his mind still. Whether or not he's been able to let it go, or it's pretty much been sitting in his head for 7 years. If his match with Khabib is any indication, got absolutely dominated. Was disheartened, lost his interim belt they worked so hard to get. Apart from a guillotine attempt, wasn't even really close. Fast forward 8-9 months after he's gotten his head right. Puts on a phenomenal showing against Dustin Poirier, winning unanimously in a 5-round main event. So that right there shows that his ego's in check. He's willing to accept a loss, determine what he did wrong, how he can improve upon it the next time, which is 100% the correct mindset to go about it. That's pretty much what's got him this far. He's damn near got the world title in his hands. He's already felt the gold around his waist, and he's displaying all the traits of a world champion. Heart, desire, grit, persistence, all necessary in order to be a champion. But although one might think because Conor has all this money that he's become lazy, he might not take his training as seriously, Whereas on the contrary, it very well could be the opposite. You look at the world's greatest athletes like LeBron James, who spends north of $10 million a season on just his recovery alone. So Conor has access to a lot of different tools and a lot of different recovery options that most fighters don't, because they're not in the same tax bracket. Like, for example, somebody like Dustin Poirier would have to go somewhere to get maybe, say, cryotherapy. Whereas somebody like Conor McGregor literally would probably just have to walk down to his basement because he's got that shit literally sitting right there. Probably his own guy to work it. So it all depends on what the fighter's fighting for. If he's fighting for money, then he already has it and he's going to be lazy, not take it as serious. But if he's looking for the notoriety and the legacy, then a fat bank account is very dangerous, because there's all these therapies, rehabs, workout regimens that only he can stick to. And why? Because he has the dollar signs to do it. And Conor McGregor is somebody that wants to be larger than life. So I feel that although he puts off this persona, that he's more of a public figure now, not necessarily a fighter, which with the mind games that Conor uses, could probably all be a part of his game plan. Because by people thinking he's a part-time fighter and that he's uncommitted, people are going to underestimate him. And underestimating Conor McGregor is probably one of the worst things you can do on the planet. It don't matter if you're rich or poor, young or old. And just anytime you count this dude out, no matter how many stats you have against him, no matter what the odds are against his favor, he'll still somehow manage to pull the win out of his ass. So on paper, Dustin looks to be the more desirable pick. And if it was anybody but Conor McGregor, I'd give him benefit of the doubt. But over the years, I have since learned my lesson. And for once, I'm going to listen to Conor and chalk him up for picking up the TKO victory in the first round in the opening minute. I just think the confidence from the first matchup is going to carry over. And I feel that no matter how far removed from a knockout you are, it always lingers with you, no matter how much time passes. I would like to be wrong. I do want this to be a competitive fight. Hopefully, if I call it the other way for once, that'll be the opposite outcome. But what can you do? The guy's undeniable. And with that, we bring our second episode of the Combat Chronicles to a close. I'm trying to figure out how that one was much longer than the first one, and we didn't even cover as much. I would like to say the third one's going to be a lot less shorter, but I think that's going to be a lie since we got to cover both these cards next week. Honestly, maybe I'll split them in half. That might be easier to digest. But if you manage to make it through the full hour and a half, y'all are fucking awesome. God bless. Looking forward to do this again for you guys next week. Hopefully on Monday.